Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you, everyone who's joining the second conversation in our two-part webinar series, Renew Democracy. I'm Curtis Schaefer, professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia and co-director of the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, which is hosting the event. I want to encourage audience members to engage in the conversation by raising questions throughout the program. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat and raise hand functions have been disabled. Our moderator and panelists will be able to see your questions and will answer them as they can. Also, we are recording today's webinar as we did in our first event last week. The footage will be made available on our website, religionlab.virginia.edu, where you can learn more about the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab. And if you are interested in programs like this, our signature podcast, Sacred and Profane. The Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab is pleased to host Renew Democracy with the University of Richmond, Jepson School of Leadership, and Wake Forest University's Interdisciplinary Humanities program. We opened this series last week with a conversation about democratic renewal in a local context. Today, a new set of conversation partners will address the challenges and possibilities of democratic renewal on a global scale. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Gar Alperovitz has had a distinguished career as an historian, political economist, activist, writer, and government official. For 15 years, he was the Lionel Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and is a former fellow of King's College, Cambridge University, Harvard's Institute of Politics, the Institute for Policy Studies, and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. He is also the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is a founding principal of the Democracy Collaborative, a research institution developing practical, policy-focused, and systematic paths towards ecologically sustainable, community-oriented change and the democratization of wealth. Our next guest, Sucheta Mahajan, is professor at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and a former chairperson of both the Center for Historical Studies and the Archives of Contemporary History at JNU. She has been Gillespie Visiting Professor at the College of Worcester, Ohio, a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, fellow of the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, visiting fellow of the Trinity Long Room Hub, Trinity College Dublin, and a visiting professor at the Maison des Sciences L'Homme in Paris. Her significant books include Independence and Partition, The Erosion of Colonial Power in India, India's Struggle for Independence, and Education and Social Change. Her fields of interest span the short and long history of the 20th century, its politics, political economy, and social change, and the oral history of independence and partition. In recent years, she has been engaged in major South-North multi-university initiatives on democracy, cultural trauma, and global humanities. Now, if you were able to join us last week, you'll have met our next two guests, so I'll introduce them more briefly. I encourage you to read their full biographies on our website. So up next, we have Corey D.B. Walker, Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, who will serve as our moderator. And finally, we welcome Thad Williamson, Associate Professor of Leadership Studies and Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law at the University of Virginia. And as I say, you're welcome to read their full biographies on the Religion, Race, and Democracy website. And now I will turn it over to our moderator, Corey Walker.
Thanks so much, Curtis. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so delighted that everyone has joined us for the second in our webinar series on Renew Democracy. In our last gathering, we confronted the challenges presented by the ongoing crisis in democracy, of democracy in the United States, with specific and sustained attention to the democratic crisis at the local level. While the crisis is broad and deep, we were inspired by ongoing efforts in the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, in creating a novel attempt to broaden and deepen democracy in its community wealth building efforts. In many ways, Richmond embodies the promises as well as the perils of new efforts to renew democracy with a vibrant civil society that continues to push for more sustained cultures of democratic responsibility and democratic accountability across all sectors of society. But to think that democracy can exist only in America or in a vacuum outside of global trends is to not only state the obvious, it's to unnecessarily draw rather our attention away from a broader, deeper crisis of democracy globally. Indeed, Melanie Barnes, who joined us last week, reminded us of this when she underscored the global democratic decline reported by Freedom House. Indeed, in their last report, Freedom House found that 25 of 41 established democracies suffered overall declines over the past 14 years. Democracy is in retreat globally as we witness the rise of new authoritarian regimes and nominally democratic governments in the wake of the stresses and strains of conflicts over what should be an international consensus about how we should govern ourselves globally. And in a moment of global pandemic, economic collapse, and ecological crisis, we see an exacerbation of these democratic drifts globally. Today, I'm excited to have Sucheta, Gar, and Thad with us to begin to examine this deep democratic deficit globally, but also to begin to understand how new openings may be presenting themselves in this moment of democratic decline. I'd like to begin with Sucheta, who joins us from New Delhi. Sucheta, democracy is in decline. You join us from the world's largest democracy. We've seen some of the challenges facing India, some deep democratic challenges in our contemporary moment. Talk to us a bit about how you understand and analyze the current democratic crisis facing us globally.
Thank you so much, Corey, for, and to the University of Virginia and to the Religion Race Lab for having me here on this very important part of this very important conversation. I'm just, as an introductory kind of statement, I thought I'd just flag two issues and then, I'd take up some other questions maybe later on. And most of what I'm saying is going to be in the context of India. And I think that's why I'm here, so that there is a voice from the global South, as it were. But before I take up the two issues that I wanted to take up, one was the shrinking of democratic space, and the second, the sharpening of structural inequalities. Let me just make a caveat, and that is I'm largely talking today about challenges to democracy in the context of the pandemic that we are facing, because I think that is the one huge reality which has changed just about everything right now in our lives. And here I thought, let me just make a proposition which would probably just set it out very in the form of a kind of paradox, that here we are today in a world where we are facing a global challenge by a pandemic, and this global pandemic is being fought by democratically elected politicians mostly on what we are told is a war footing in the so-called national interest, and at whose altar we are asked as ordinary citizens to sacrifice whatever we have left of our democratic rights. So I think this is a huge paradox that we're in right now. And in India, what we are facing today is a huge shrinking of the democratic space, so much so that I think a claim like we're the world's largest democracy is something which sounds very hollow today, in the sense it's just reduced to numbers, number of people. Today we are facing an undeclared emergency. Um, According to the Press Freedom Index of Reporters Without Borders, there are so many such reports, but I'm just taking one of them. India stands at an appalling 142nd out of 180 countries in 2020, and we've fallen 6 places back since 2015. Yesterday, as I was just reading up for today's webinar, I came across a statement by 99 ex-civil servants who had occupied the highest offices on the land, who called this an undeclared emergency, and they made a statement, which civil servants, as you know, are normally not wont to make such statements. So I think it's very important, where they called for adherence to the rule of law, and they called for a nationwide movement to uphold the Constitution, a Constitution which for years radicals just, dismissed as kind of a bourgeois document, which we really didn't care about. So what is this undeclared emergency? There's of course the usual blatant violation of liberties, drowning out of the voices of people. But what's different now is, and more dangerous, I would say, is that fighting this pandemic in the so-called national interest has become an excuse for further suppression of dissent, and indeed even passing of restrictive laws. You will be shocked to know that the Epidemic Diseases Act, which has recently been invoked, goes back to the colonial era. It has not even been, reformed at all. There are new labor laws on the anvil which talk about 12-hour and 6-day weeks. Governments are going to be allowed, state governments can pass these laws now, which commentators have called going back to 19th century barbarism. Surveillance has crept in, and this is all through the back door, in the form of technology. It becomes mandatory, for example, if you want to take a flight in India, you have to upload an application which is ostensibly to map the location of people suspected of having the COVID virus, but actually it compromises your privacy in hugely unimaginable ways. So we have a situation, to sum up this part, where normal political activities have just been suspended. You cannot even put up a placard to express your dissent. The state has gone on a witch hunt of so-called anti-nationals, mainly Muslims, but also dissenters, critics, activists, students from my university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is one of the liberal universities in India, have been picked up for no good reason and slapped with charges of sedition. The head of the Delhi Minorities Commission, his task is to look after the minorities' interests, has been recently booked for sedition. I mean, the list just goes on. So shrinking of democratic space is the first important or the biggest challenge. And along with that comes that the way in which this democratically elected government that we have has adopted strategies to deal with the pandemic, which have exacerbated structural inequalities, whether these are along lines of class, gender, race, or in the case of India, religion-based community. And you would be shocked to know, your audience would be shocked to know, that here, as Europe found its Jews, US has its Afro-Americans, in India, of course, it's always the Muslims. 200 million Muslims have been the focus of anti-Muslim hate speech, since the present ruling party came to power, and now this has just gone berserk. Muslims have been vilified in the social media. A leader from the ruling party. This is not some extremist right-wing person. This is a leader of the ruling party described Muslims as human bombs who are intending to spread the virus. Words like corona jihad are being used in the media. And emboldened by support from their leaders, there are, of course, extreme right-wing groups, Hindu communal groups who are going around beating and lynching Muslims and calling for their boycott. It's actually quite horrific what is happening. And linked with this, of course, and I will end with this, is, of course, what's happened to the poor. The poor, and this is where the class inequality, and it's probably here where it's the most. The poor were most hit by the sudden lockdown, 4 hours notice, and we were locked down for 2 months. And a survey done by a newspaper pointed out that 34% households in India could only last out for a week with their provisions and income. This was sometime in April. They would need assistance. But rather than giving them assistance, the entire media was full of what I can only call searing images of the long march home by these poor migrants. And they were beaten on the way by policemen. It was a criminalization of poverty such as we have not seen in our lifetimes. My parents, who came as refugees at the time of partition from what is now Pakistan, used to talk about this kind of a movement and what it was. But here there is also state violence, which is there along with it. People being mowed down by trains or just falling to the side of the road, exhausted, hungry, helpless. And of course, the contrast is with how people like us, the privileged, who are all over social media, where people are just sharing posts all the time about ennui, about boredom. What should I see on Netflix? Oh God, I've run out of recipes for Far Eastern food. So this is the kind of inequality that we are facing and we're talking about in this overall situation of shrinkage of democratic space. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you so much, Sucheta. You really bring the democratic crisis to really to a point of sharpness and underscoring the ways in which we have the shrinking of democratic spaces. And in that shrinking, we see new authoritarian movements, both by the state as well as through civil society, by the mobilization of ethnic and religious hatred, and utilizing those ethnic and religious hatreds to consolidate particular anti-democratic regimes. And the sharpness of inequality, the sharpness of global inequality and inequality within societies really brings to the forefront the crisis of democratic governance and democratic possibility. I'm reminded that in India, Modi operationalized the lockdown in a few hours, and that left folks with just 4 hours, and that left folks with no resources. And of course, the long march then enabled the mobilization of different forms of violence, both state sanctioned as well as informal sectors of violence. So democracy does ring a bit hollow when we use those empty phrases, world's largest democracy, when democracy isn't real in the everyday. Gara, let me turn to you. We've heard from Sucheta and the challenges facing democracy in India. Begin to give us a way of thinking and a way of understanding our contemporary moment when democracy is on decline globally in the midst of a global pandemic, and how you begin to understand this particular moment that we're in.
Well, let me stand back and say, I want to talk a bit about some positive things that are developing within the danger, within the threat, and the dynamics between the two in the United States in particular. First, let me say, as some of you know, I've been a historian of the bombing of Hiroshima, which is coming up, the 75th anniversary will be up in 2 weeks. We have both not used nuclear weapons since that time, but also simultaneously there's been a massive proliferation in an era when there have been authoritarian governments with those weapons, and there are great dangers. So I want to put that on the middle of the discussion. It often gets this aside. In the United States, I think what's striking to me is that there is, on the one hand, the failure of the traditional social democratic structure, which is, we call it liberalism in the United States, social democracy in Europe, which was a politics of balancing the power of the corporation and power of people like Mr. Trump with a politics significantly supported by labor unions all over the Western world, was a major institutional base for that politics. And it sort of kept a rough balance. In some cases, labor was 85%, as in Sweden, and you had a strong welfare state. I'm obviously oversimplifying. In the United States, it never reached more than 34%. It is now that power base for a progressive politics in the United States is not 85% as it was at the peak in Sweden, not 34% as it was here, but 6% and radically declining. So the institutional backing, and people don't often probe to this, but we political economists and historians understand that without institutional power, politics is a weak entity. That's very weak in the United States, and I think the election of Donald Trump is part and parcel of that weakness and that failing of the democratic process enforced by progressive institutional power. On the other hand, and I want to open this direction of things beginning to build in a new direction that offers some prospect and hope for the longer term. Now, I'm a historian as well as a political economist, so I think it's useful to think in decade terms, although I've worked in House and Senate and at the highest levels of the US government as well. So I have a political near-term as well as a long-term view of this. But I would point out that there are new developments at the grassroots level. There is the Bernie Sanders movement, which demonstrated far greater progressive politics at the movement level. But there are also very interesting developments at the local level. Thad may speak some about this as well, but we're seeing all over this country and now in Great Britain and experiments in Denmark and in Spain of community-wide ownership efforts, which have a political economy re-empowering of the base of politics, in a way taking the place of labor unions as the institutional power base of a progressive or left politics. We're beginning to see that in many parts of the country around a theme, and I think the theme is important politically and economically. For those of you who want to know more about it, the biggest ones are in Cleveland, Ohio, the Evergreen Cooperative structure, community-wide structures of ownership. In England, it's Preston. There's a very, very powerful examples there, and many, many more on the websites we can give you attention to. But the building up at the community level of new forms of ownership, social development, ecological development, reminds me very much of the prehistory of what became the New Deal in the United States. The development at the state and local level, which became enlarged in the Roosevelt administration to national politics and national policy. So the press doesn't cover much of this, but there's an extraordinary amount which the institute I'm associated with has been researching going on at the local level that I think offers hope in combination with the new movements. Now, I'm not Pollyannic about this. I think Mr. Trump and also the forces he represents are very dangerous. But the longer term prospect is whether or not we can rebuild from the bottom up, not simply politically, and not simply socially, and not simply ecologically in terms of the movements, but also the institutional structures that empower the, John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous American liberal economist, 20th century economist, used to talk about countervailing power, that the corporate dominated politics of the right needed to be countervailed not only through elections and democratic politics, but through institutional power. And in most of the advanced Western countries, that was labor unions empowering a progressive politics. With the decline of labor here, and even in Sweden, the most advanced of these, the reconstruction of new community empowerment, both economically, politically, but also morally, a vision of community as a guiding principle is beginning to be reconstructed at the grassroots level. And there are many experiments, if we have time to talk about, that are quite advanced, involving large-scale ownership by workers and community in this country and abroad. And I see this, viewing it as a historian, as a developmental trajectory as the decay of the old political economic models fail. So I want to set that as one part. The other, and I've written spent a very good deal of time on foreign policy. American foreign policy has been constrained more and more in terms of having burnt the fingers of the policymakers on repeated war interventions that failed. We're seeing a great deal of posturing, and there is a great deal of danger in the arms race. But I think it's fair to say, and most people don't realize it, the military budget is at the 3 to 4% level of the GDP in the United States. Very large in the absolute, but very reduced in terms of the percentages. So the longer perspective that I want to offer to consideration for this discussion is, even as the decaying international posture of the American old interventionist war possibilities is decaying, and even as the labor union base of progressive politics is decaying, and even as the politics of a populist like Mr. Trump faces us as a danger and threat, simultaneously there is the beginning of a whole new movements, both politically, and we've seen that in the Bernie Sanders movement, and so in the ecological movement and the feminist movement, but also more important in some ways, or equally important, new institutional forms. For the first time, we're seeing people talking about public ownership of the oil companies and taking them over. We're seeing community ownership, neighborhood ownership, municipal ownership in cities as far-ranging as Detroit or Cleveland, but also in Boulder, Colorado. We're seeing experimentation not often covered by the press, far-reaching experimentation in new forms of democratic ownership, along with the political and moral reconstruction that you see in the Sanders movement, the environmental movement, and the feminist movement. So viewing it as a historian, the moment of Donald Trump is one thing, and a very dangerous moment in this country. But on the other hand, there is a constraining possibility globally against interventionism. We've gotten our fingers burnt so many times on that, there's caution on the interventionist side, I hope. And on the other hand, a slow buildup of the ideas, the institutions, and the politics for a longer reconstruction of American politics. So I think we're in a very dangerous, but also a period of possibility of the long haul. For those of you who know something about our own history in the United States, much of what became the New Deal was actually developed in the 1920s and the prehistory of the New Deal in experimentation at the state and local level. And I think we're living in a similar period in the United States at what's happening at the grassroots level in terms of new ownership structure, ecological structures, solar development, vast range of developmental possibilities, combined with the local politics that I see as the basis, potentially. I'm no utopian, but potentially there is a new building of power that I think can begin to lay the foundations for a longer term transformative possibilities. One last thing, oddly, we have noticed in the United States at moments of crisis, the last time in the Great Recession, we nationalized General Motors, Chrysler, we nationalized AT&T, one of the biggest insurance companies in the world. And so crisis moments of potential major or minor semi-crises also open interesting possibilities in this country. So I am worried about the immediate questions. Mr. Trump may act in an unruly way in this election. He's showing more and more signs of erratic behavior. But in terms of the longer term buildup of the country, I think there is reason to be hopeful about the direction of not only politics and not only movements, but of institutional design. we're posed with the question, and I think it is an exciting question as well as a daunting one, if the traditional models of socialism, state socialism, Soviet Union, are faulting, if social democracy, as in Sweden or even in the weak forms in the United States and Great Britain, is faltering because the labor union base is collapsing. And that's what's happening in both countries. Our own labor is down to 6% of the labor force. Sweden, it was at 85%. What is the new system, the next society? And I think we're being the ground and the seedlings being built around these new community structures, the call for nationalization, which occurs and has occurred and is likely to reoccur, regional structures like the Tennessee Valley Authority in this country. I think we're seeing the laying down of ideas, experimentation, political movements that offer the possibility, not more, but not less, of the beginning of the foundations of a new direction for the country here. One would hope, and certainly that is the direction I would urge we begin to pay attention to and work towards.
Thanks so much, Gar. You not only point out that we are in a moment of democratic crisis, but in this moment, there are openings that are opening up with folks who are working on the ground to exploit the fractures in our democratic culture and democratic politics, to begin to think, how do we begin to reconstruct society along new lines? How do we begin to develop responsive institutions that respond not only to our democratic deficits and our economic inequalities, but also to the highest aspirations we have as human beings and the highest aspirations for a new egalitarian society. You also remind us that the reconstruction of democratic possibility is not just built on the residue of the old, but more importantly, how bold we can face the new and willingness to experiment with new arrangements, new formations across all sectors of society. I want to turn now to Thad in order to get some intellectual, just to grab some intellectual understanding of this moment, when in a certain way we can see that we have the emergence of new democratic possibilities and new understandings of democracy. So Thad, in a moment where we see and witness a deep democratic deficit, both within the US and globally, but we also are witness to new possibilities of democratic community emerging within the US and emerging in global society. How do we begin to make sense of this dialectic of democracy where we have this deep democratic deficit, but we have a renewed aspiration for a deeper democracy that even exceeds previous forms of democracy and responding to the highest aspirations of human possibility?
Thank you, Corey, and thanks again to organizers of this. As always, Dr. Walker poses a multi-layered, challenging question, so I'll do my best. I mean, I think the first thing to put on the table is that we do ourselves a disservice when we act as if democracy is an idea without enemies, right? As if it's not a threat to certain people. And let me just break that down a little bit. I mean, I think when we talk about political democracy, people, commonly reference, 4 different aspects. Talk about representation, the idea that whoever's running the government should come from the people. Talk about accountability to the people. That is, you can't just do anything you want, and there has to be some structure of making sure that what you do aligns with what people want. Thirdly, we talk about empowerment, which is that anybody can have a voice. Anybody can raise any issue at any time. Anybody can organize for change at any time, whether they're in power or not. And then lastly, we talk about governance, providing basically the basis of order, but also addressing problems, our collective problems in real time. Well, if you look at like the first 3 of those, I mean, representation, accountability, empowerment, those all are specifically democratic qualities that speak to the concept of political equality. And that's what defines democracy, is its aspiration to political equality. But obviously you can't have that unless you have 2 other things. One is a pretty robust measure of socioeconomic equality, because people with vastly different, levels of wealth and income are going to have different levels of influence, in political voice. And John Rawls, who his book is coming up about 50 years old next year, and maybe passe in some circles, his theory of justice, but it still provides a lot of resources for working out the internal connection between the idea of equal democracy and equal socioeconomic regimes. You really cannot have one without the other. And so the second thing, besides socioeconomic equality, is the idea of a robust public sphere and a public state, public spaces. But the idea that government can be a tool to advance the interests of people. Okay, so I think what we've seen in the U.S., but to some extent globally, is kind of an attack on that logic by people who are threatened by these ideas. They see where they're going. They realize that if democracy truly builds a virtuous circle where greater political empowerment is leading to a greater narrowing of the socioeconomic gaps, people with privilege want to stop that. And so they have been in various ways. Sometimes it's through racial and ethnic division. Sometimes it's through an attack on, quote unquote, the government. But then it speaks to the last part, and the most dangerous part for now is people pointing to the failures of governance, the fact that we're not solving our problems adequately, especially climate change, but many, many others. The U.S. has been, literally a disaster in responding to COVID. People are looking at that governance failure, and it doesn't necessarily go in a pro-democratic direction in terms of the practical conclusion. It might go into an authoritarian direction. Someone say, see, I told you this doesn't work, and provide a scapegoat, and then offer themselves, or sort of restrictions on democracy as the way to solve the immediate problem. So, I think it's important to be aware of all those dynamics as we think through what it is to revitalize democracy. So as we're making sure, we have to solve the problems, we have to do so in a democratic way and not take the shortcut. And really, I think, the intellectual discussion that is ongoing and that needs to happen is there's one group of folks who think that trying to do a sort of a social democratic restoration is the strategy. If we can go back to the 50s and 60s in the US context when we had high tax rates and inequality seemed to be narrowing a little bit, if we can just recreate that whole picture, that we can get a handle on this. And there are others, and Gar is a preeminent proponent of this, and I think quite persuasive, is that you can't reconstruct that world even if you wanted to, and that world was flawed to start with. Instead, we're in a world we have to reinvent a new system of democracy in real time. And what's really hard is that the urgent problems are right there in front of us. And anyone who gets even a snippet of power, whether it's a mayor or a president, is going to be at some point overwhelmed by those problems and consumed by them, right? And after you're in their office for a little while, you own it. And so we have to change our thinking to think about how can we do systemic change of the long haul, so it doesn't really matter who holds those offices, but the progress is in the right direction. Because this idea that you're going to elect a president who's going to be a savior is, I think, misguided, and another one of the sort of false ideas we need to put behind this. So I hope that's helpful, just to put that on the table. But in simple terms, democracy has enemies because its internal logic is sort of threatening of elites. And in the situation that we're in now, we have to look to reconstruct a different system, that's entirely new, and obviously not ignoring the past or not taking the positive out of the past and present, but the system we need to create needs to be different in kind than what we've seen before. It won't be adequate to meet the actual challenges.
Thad, I want to thank you for really bringing to the forefront the issue of democratic enemies within democratic regimes and how deep inequality within democratic regimes exacerbates democratic legitimacy. And as we talk about democratic deficits globally, we're also facing a legitimation crisis around democracy as an ideal and as a political form. And it's within that democratic, that legitimation crisis where we see new authoritarian regimes occupying space to provide individuals with safety and security to assuage fears and to allay concerns. I'd like to move back to Sucheta on this simply because in your context in India, you're seeing the mobilization of these of new forms of hatred, of new anti-democratic forms of governance. Talk to us a bit about some of the opportunities that are being mobilized by different communities. I know some of the work that you're doing at JMU really is geared towards building that next democracy, going deeper than just being a democracy, the world's largest democracy based on just a population figure, but actually going deeper. Talk to us a bit about some of the things that you see going on that are attempting to assuage this democratic crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. I thought some of the things that Gar and Thad and others made was so important, to the discussion. And as a historian, I think the kind of, rethinking that's been happening that I see around me is a lot to do with going back to our recent past, in our case, to our anti-colonial struggle, which, apart from its anti-imperialist orientation, was also a movement which brought about huge churning among the masses on all kinds of issues, So from democracy through consensus, focus on civil liberties, a new kind of internationalism where Jawaharlal Nehru wanted to get up and go and fight in the Spanish Civil War, that kind of, we have these cultural resources. We don't have to look towards the Greek polis or to, some other idea of direct democracy in practice. We have our panchayats, which are, direct democracy and decentralized decision-making, which are working sometimes not so well, but there's a whole system out there of governance, of self-governance with direct participation by citizens, which one can look at, recover, restore, etc. So I think you would find it very interesting that even in very left-wing universities like mine, there is a rediscovery of Gandhi, there's a rediscovery of Tagore, there's a recognition. However, it's not so simple because in India, as you know, our present is encapsulated at one moment of time, so many different stages of development, which other countries would have gone through, say, over centuries. So communism, regular kind of old style communism, also thrives very well in one part of India, in like Kerala, for example, which it would interest you to know, the only state in India with a communist government. It's called the Communist Party of India, Marxist, quite dogmatic, but they've done a fantastic job as far as containing the pandemic is concerned, and their health minister has been honored by the United Nations organizations, etc. But basically, it's an example of global best practice, So we can't, like you say, the old type of socialism is over. No, it makes sense, or it's making sense in certain areas. As I said, in other very creative spaces like the universities, and at the community level, for example, what Gar talked about for, in other parts of the world. But there's been a fantastic, again, I would say, efflorescence of community level organizations, and civil society movements, what are called new social movements, not the regular style of institutional politics at all, but around issues, around right to information, on right to food, right to employment, these are very different kind of movements, which I wrote a book about one of them, which was about, right to education. And it was amazing. The woman who was behind this initiative, uh, she was a political scientist in a university in South India, and she started this off. She was a Maoist. She wrote her first book on Maoism, and she was, like a committed Maoist almost, and she discovered Gandhi and self-sufficiency, decentralization, and most of all, working with nonviolence. And she built up at the grassroots level this. She was also the reason I'm talking about her is not just because I wrote this book on her, but she was the first PhD of our university. So she's one of us. And later on, her movement then became like best practice in development for the government, and a national commission for protection of child rights was formed. So I think I would completely go with Gar in this, that, you know, um, the reason we're here and we're talking is not because we're here to, we're only, like steeped in pessimism. No, it's because of this excitement that there is at the possibility that despite being in these almost like, you're facing a leviathan kind of state sometimes, or a behemoth, and it's huge and you're worried and you're scared. And I personally have many cases against me, in the university, etc. I was thrown out of my chairpersonship for just opposing things. So we live in this world. It's tough, it's worrying, etc. But what's happening around us and the kind of world we are part of, what we've been seeing, is just fantastic. How how students, how teachers, how just ordinary people, the kind of tales of courage that comes. And as I said, the amazing cultural resources we have to fight this kind of right-wing Hindutva, this populism, the casteist, the whole thing, that edifice, this is there. But, we have the resources, and that's what, being a civilizational sort of state, I think really helps over there. So we certainly see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you so much, Sucheta. You remind us that the resources available to us don't just come from one place, but they come from many places. And these deep civilizational resources offer us new opportunities for democratic renewal in ways that we don't immediately think of. And these international dialogues really open up an understanding of the possibilities that are there. And no one possibility has to speak for all spaces. And of course, the work in Kerala, I'm thinking of a good colleague there, Vijay Prashad at the Tricontinental, doing some great work there. So there's some opportunities that are always there. And Gar, I want to turn to you with this. Sucheta has reminded us of the deep roots, deep democratic possibilities, deep democratic resources available to respond to this current crisis. You've made a book available over the past 2 years, articulating ideas around the pluralist commonwealth that can help us in this democratic moment. Talk to us briefly about that project and how it can begin to revitalize and even restructure democracy in the US when we think of this huge space, this 3,000 mile continental space, and how we move forward to respond in our contemporary moment.
Well, let me just say that the book, we made the book available free on our website. It's called The Pluralist Commonwealth, and the website is the Democracy Collaborative. You can easily find it, and you can get the whole book free. But what I do want to pick up on what both of you have said, and Thad has said, and Sucheta particularly recently, at the grassroots level in the United States, there is an explosion of experimentation and of political action and of environmental action. The prehistory the developing history of movements, but also worker-owned companies, community-owned development, land trusts, neighborhood ownership, city ownership, proposals for and when in the last big crisis, we nationalized General Motors, we nationalized Chrysler, we nationalized AIG, which is the largest insurance company in the world. People don't realize an insurance company is a gigantic financial institution, like a bank. And there are minor crises like that, and there's a developmental process of great creativity of people involved, not only in politics, but in developing new institutions simultaneously and new environmental movements. So if you see this as a historical possibility, the wealth of experience being developed in activism, in experimental projects, some of them quite sophisticated. There are 400 or 500 people working under community worker ownership in Cleveland right now. There are municipal takeovers in Boulder, Colorado. There are land ownership by neighborhoods in many parts of the country, the proposals for public ownership coming out. This is a very rich prehistory for the next larger progressive developmental thrust at that level. Viewed historically, there are great dangers. Mr. Trump faces us with great dangers. There could be violence and repression. Those are not to be ruled out. But at another level entirely, the future, sort of like the emergence of a picture in a photographer's development. Slowly you can see the image of new society beginning to develop at the grassroots level and at the activism level. So I am not a utopian of kind of fantasies that there are no struggles. I think we're in for some very dangerous periods before us. But there is also, I think, a building of power and ideas and politics and new things, new ideas about how to change the system in practical terms, very practical terms, at the local, regional, national, state, at every level. We're seeing developmental ideas emerging in organized activism as well. So I think that the coming period in America, and also the simultaneous retreat from American wars abroad and in semi-imperial forms, I think there's some possibilities that a progressive movement of a real democratizing movement in Thad's sense of the word democracy is not beyond our possibilities. In any case, that's where the emphasis and hope lies for the next period, I think.
Gar, you remind us, and I'm reminded that we're in a moment where both Bernie, when we think of Bernie Sanders and the Sanders movement, we think of Black Lives Matter as a movement beginning to really make some policy pressures throughout the U.S. And its international ties, modes of new forms of solidarity that are really connecting these movements across nation states. That does open up space for the expression of a new type of democratic politics. And even globally, we have Yanis Varoufakis and Bernie Sanders coming together and creating the Progressive International, just launched in May, and we'll see what happens with that going forward. Thad, I want to talk to you a bit about some of your work and really how we can leverage all of these new tendencies to begin to develop new and more robust policy frameworks, moral calls for democratic renewal that really are catalyzed and linked to new ways of imagining community, new ways of imagining political subjectivity. Talk to us a bit about some of the work in which you're doing and really expanding the idea of community wealth building in a context, in a state that has been in some ways, some significant ways, averse to really novel forms of public policy that respond to the pressures of broader civil society.
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly, as we discussed last week, this is an incredible time to be in Richmond, to be America in general, and likely globally as well, when you think about the reckoning that's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, that's one of the things I learned from Gar a long time ago, that one aspect of the needed change has to be, for lack of a better term, a revolution in consciousness, right? That people have to be able to see and imagine something different, and they have to be able to shed the way they've been taught to understand the past. And so I think you see now in this moment, especially with the younger generation, maybe even some older folks too, a greater awareness and recognition that so much of what we have in America, and by extension globally, is based on vast historical crimes that we've inherited from the past, and we have enormous moral debts from the past, and that includes even some of Gar's work on Hiroshima, where I was working with him when he published his book at the 50th anniversary, and there was, as he will no doubt recall, a lot of flack he got from challenging the conventional wisdom that many people were invested in. And they weren't so much invested in the facts of the case, they were invested in the narrative of America's inherent goodness, right? And so now I think we finally are at a point where we can cast away that claim to innocence and say, let's get real here, let's be honest about our past, but also recognize the positive trajectories as well, the positive potentials and possibilities. And so I think community wealth building for me is fundamentally a moral frame about how are we actually going to build something that's never been done before in the history of humanity, which is a truly equitable, multiracial, inclusive democracy that's also ecologically sustainable, right? And you pose that question, it immediately becomes a global one because there's something to learn from everybody, because there are communities all across the world that have taken on pieces of this, and so I think this conversation does have to be global, not just at the state level, but at the municipal level. And so what happened in Cleveland, was informed by what happened in Mondragon, in the Basque region of Spain, 50 or 60 years ago, and now you have people from different countries learning what's happened, in Cleveland. And so I think if we can think of this as sort of a vast global learning project in which nobody has a determinate answer, but there are many, many avenues and possibilities to pursue, I think that's the right way to think about it. And specifically, in the American context, in terms of community wealth building becoming that policy paradigm, as I said before, to say it a little more overtly, I'm not against people invoking the New Deal as such. I usually know what they mean. It comes from a good place. But that's not literally what we want or the answer. We don't want sort of the federal government being the only progressive actor in our system. We want to empower local communities to make their own decisions, where we can actually have local activists come to the table and help set the platform, help set the agenda based on their knowledge of what's actually going on at the local level, and then bring in the resources from the other systems to support that, as opposed to sort of the bureaucratic top-down model that the traditional New Deal represents. So I think community wealth building is a way to flip American federalism in a way that's both more democratic, and I think also has a better chance of making traction on our problems. And I'm hopeful, because I think regardless of which Democrat have won the nomination, all of them, including Mr. Biden, if he should be elected president, is going to have to go in this direction, because they're going to find pretty quickly that they may be able to get, because it's a crisis, be able to get some one or two big national reforms, but pretty soon, as in the New Deal itself, they're going to run out of political capital, and they'll be limited in what they can do in terms of the massive federal transformation. You got to be pushed down back to, okay, what can we do at the local and state level that's more strategic, and use the dollars you have to try to seed things that lead to bolder, more radical steps at the local level. So I do think that we will see that playing out, hopefully as soon as next January. If it takes a little bit longer, it takes a little bit longer. But I think the logic that we have to approach the problem that way is inescapable.
Thanks so much, Thad. You remind us of one of the key components and key principles that have undergirded our conversations, our two conversations around renewed democracy. And that key principle really is about creating a learning space about democratic possibility. That in this moment of deep crisis, we understand that the democratic deficits in the US and globally are broad and deep, and they affect multiple sectors of society. But even in this moment of crisis, there are opportunities that we see opportunities where individuals are moving and responding to the deepest and highest aspirations for human community in new ways and in new manners that really will enable us to not only meet the crisis, but also to then build a new world. Last week, I ended our conversation with Walt Whitman's, with a statement for Walt Whitman's Democratic Vistas. This week, I'd like to end our conversation quoting the words of Arundhati Roy, who reminds us in this moment of pandemic that there is possibility. What that possibility is, we don't know yet, but we can walk through it together. And she writes, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I want to thank you, Sucheta, Gar, and Thad, for reminding us of this possibility. Let's go through the portal lightly. Let's go through the portal and struggle for a new world. Thank you and good afternoon.